Yeah, semillero was this process in which we're interested in developing three key pillars in the development of a person. We are looking to develop their capacity to hold relationships to the world, to themselves, and with other people. We are also emphasized in to create that capacity, to develop the capacity of self-knowledge. So get to know yourself as much as you're getting to know the world. And out of that comes then the capacity to co-create, use your skills, use your insights, and project your person out into the world so that it can relate to the rest of the world.
Welcome everybody back to another episode of Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I'm your host, Gabe Crane. I'm joined as always by my host, Rahul Didwania. And today we are welcoming Arturo Esquero to the show for an episode titled Learning as Living, Exploring the Social Learning Organism. And so if you enjoy listening to us, please take a moment to share with a friend or leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Join our newsletter to follow along the journey. You can find that at wovenwings.net. And again, Arturo Esquero is our guest today. He's an education innovator and co-founder of the social learning organism / school, which we'll get into the details of that, called Semillero, which is in Valle de Bravo outside Mexico City in Mexico. And so really the big theme for today is this notion of learning. And you might have heard concepts such as being a lifelong learner and things like that. But we're really looking today at learning as a fundamental activity of life. And as living beings, how learning is so essential for us to be able to access to experience vibrant lives. And so on that note, Rahul, I just want to bring you into this conversation. It's great to be here with you again, man. And I'm curious, this title, I feel like we're gonna have to break this down for folks and really even understand it. But I'm just curious, when we talk about learning, talk about this idea of a social learning organism, what does it spark for you, and what does it kind of bring up that you're interested for today's conversation?
Thank you, Gabe, as always. And I think just starting with learning, I think just means quite a bit to me at this stage in my life. I think I used to view learning as something you did at school and then you figured out what you needed to figure out and then you knew what you needed to do. And yes, obviously you're always learning things as you go, but you by and large know what you need to know. And it's not something I never necessarily thought about that way explicitly, but in retrospect, I realized that I carried that attitude towards learning. And as I've gotten older, I've really realized that it's anything but that. That's almost that the more you know, the deeper you go into your life, the more you realize that learning is a constant, that everything that we do can be an opportunity for us to learn. And learning is intricately tied to growth, and this idea of growing, becoming more of ourselves, becoming better and more expressive versions of ourselves. That of course is largely at the core of a lot of the stuff that we're doing and the types of conversations that we're having. But then the other piece is, and this is now dipping more into this idea of a learning organism, which I'll say is a new term, that I learned from Arturo and excited to explore more, is that learning is not just all about learning ourselves, right, and growing ourselves, but actually learning is also a relational process. And what's coming to me right now is that conversation, Gabe, that we had in our chat with Kaitna, about Buddhism and about this idea that even in the story of Gautam, Buddha, like he went and sought to seek enlightenment under a tree and found a lot of insight there, but ultimately concluded that actually even the path to enlightenment came through interaction with the world and with people and with life. And that idea to me has really stuck. And so when I think about this concept of a learning organism or a social learning organism, that relational dynamic really jumps out to me. This idea that we learn both independently, but even more so in concert with one another, and in concert with the world and everything that the world and the lived experience brings with it. And that concept, I think, is super, super rich. And I'm very excited to go into it more deeply and understand how to really integrate it into the way that we move through the world. And, that Arturo is associated with an organization or an organism, an organism that's really built on those principles, is something that I'm very much looking forward to exploring. And I know we've talked about those principles. So, Gabe, I'd love to hear you kind of talk about that a little bit, expound on those principles and what they mean and what they can mean for us as we carry forward into this conversation.
100%. You touched on the social learning organism component, and especially the social aspect of that. And so we'll dive into that with Arturo. One thing that term brings up for me is the organism. And you had correction from the organization to the organism part. And the part that I want to emphasize here before we bring Arturo in is that learning is connected with our own sense of aliveness, our own organicity. I'm probably not saying that right, but our ability to feel alive and to actually not be ossified into a kind of frozen state, which is, as we know from learning sciences, that's what happens us as we get older. There's that phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And I think when we think about learning conventionally, we think about learning as the beginning steps. It's kind of down on the totem pole, and eventually you ascend and you become the teacher or you become the master, and then you're not a learner anymore. And that is so backwards. Actually, Yuansa, my Qigong teacher, talks about learning and growth as you connected those two concepts. Learning and growth is really the meaning of life. And there's no real time that we're not learning and growing. Or in Zen Buddhism, they talk about the beginner's mind and the importance of the beginner's mind, which is also the learning mind. When we think we know something, when our mind becomes full of concepts, we lose the humility to be a participant in life and to actually be moved by life and informed by it and thereby grow. I think that a lot of elements of our traditional education systems, kind of reinforce this or challenge us. But I think it's also embedded in our nervous system. We like to figure something out and then we create a pattern around that and we run the pattern because it's more efficient. And that has its place. But what it does also do is it sets us into ways that if we don't have the mechanisms to open up and expand ourselves and humble ourselves to go outside of that pattern, then we can become trapped in that pattern. And we can lose, again, what starts to happen there is then our soul starts to fade a little bit. The vibrancy of our life starts to fade. That's why learning is so essential, to be able to always return ourselves into that moment. Just a couple points to frame where we're going today as we kind of explore this more deeply. But on that note, I do want to bring in our guest today, Arturo. Arturo Esquerro is a devoted family man that has committed his life to education innovation. Soon after he obtained a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, which I actually know him well from this time in my life. We're very good friends from his undergraduate degree. Arturo realized that his calling was actually in education. And after working as a certified Waldorf grade teacher and IB diploma science teacher in private schools, he noticed that there was a great need to reclaim our educational sovereignty. And so since 2017, he has teamed up with two other passionate educators, and together they embarked on the expedition to explore the complex waters of education and community building through this project Semillero, which, again, as we talked about, they've conceived as a social learning organism. Arturo's passion for the natural sciences has also driven him to develop a program of science learning wilderness camps focused on awakening the innate scientist within each one of us through Goethean observation practices. And so on that note, Arturo, thanks so much for being present with us today. It's so awesome to have you on the show. And I guess just as a first question to you, building off of what Rahul and I were just riffing on in the introduction, from your perspective, why is learning so critical and essential to survival and thriving?
Wow. Well, thanks for that intro, guys, and setting up this great subject that is so profound and important to us. I agree, Gabe. And first of all, I want to be very grateful with you guys for all this work that you do around vibrant living. I've been really inspired by your podcast. I've been following him for a while. Beyond just my personal connection to you, Gabe, I really am always very awakened by the subjects you guys take on, and I appreciate it so much. So thanks for inviting me over and starting this conversation. Your question, Gabe, is why do I think this is such a crucial part of living? And I think you guys really touched upon it in a very profound way by these concepts of ossification and of like figuring out the system. So I think that for me it has become a process of understanding that it's a dynamic process of going in and out of these truths, in consolidating these truths and then moving out from them. And so it's kind of like a tree is building, right? It's building enough mass through creating its cellular structures, which are firm and rigid, but it's also always expanding and changing them. So letting them go, right? And so I think that metaphor has been really important to me. And I think it's like you were saying, Gabe, that I think that this dance in moving through that process is what informs our soul about all the experiences that we're going through and allow us to grow in a deeper sense. And most importantly too, it's like you were bringing out, guys, about the relational aspect, that this world happens all throughout relations. So in the Goethean sense, this reality that we're perceiving is all a threshold manifesting the interaction between different forces, and that's why we see light, that's why we feel temperature, and with those perceptions we create these images and we create these concepts, and then start to kind of reconfirm them around ourselves. And so I think that learning is precisely about staying in that humble beginner's mindset, which allows you to keep opening new spaces, right? And that's where growth comes from. Because if you settle down on the quote unquote certainties that you obtain through your knowledge, then the world then suddenly just consolidates and becomes dull, right? And just like, and I think that's when everything starts to kind of, that's where putrefaction happens, right? In stale water. That's why I think learning is important, because it keeps moving, right? It keeps letting that water flow.
The image that's coming to me from what you said is the image of like a student, in a traditional classroom who maybe already knows the content, and comes in and is like, okay, I already know this, I'm kind of bored. And you see like an activation or a curiosity just sort of disappear from that person. And what you were just talking about is like antithesis of that, right? It's like when we are in a curious and activated state, the world really opens up. With that said, what I'd love to learn a little bit about is how is learning different at Semillero? Like a relative, I'd say, to like what you experienced or what many of us likely experienced growing up in a classroom or teaching in a classroom. We'd love to just hear a little bit about Semillero and what it's all about.
Great. I'd be glad to tell you about a little bit about that. Yeah, Semillero was this process in which we're interested in developing three key pillars in the development of a person. We're looking to develop their capacity to hold relationships to the world, to themselves, and with other people. We are also emphasized in to create that capacity, to develop the capacity of self-knowledge. So get to know yourself as much as you're getting to know the world. And out of that comes then the capacity to co-create, use your skills use your insights and project your person out into the world so that it can relate to the rest of the world.
Arturo, what has that looked like specifically in this project? I know, in speaking with you and being good friends with you, this project has taken place in kind of a small town outside Mexico City, kind of a rural environment where you've been working with engaging different community members and families around, well, I called it a school in the introduction, but you've been active in kind of reframing our understanding of that it kind of is a school and it is not. I'm curious if you could help us understand those pillars as they've kind of, or not even so much just about the pillars, but just understand a little bit more of the context and the color that surrounds this project, just what it looks like so that listeners can kind of connect.
Semillero is this project that started out of this coming together of me and these two other educators, that we were realizing that there's something that was not responding to a profound need in the learners that we were working with. Because precisely what Rahul was mentioning, that environment in the classroom where you expect to see a lot of engagement and excitement about learning, but suddenly I would find myself as a teacher being very responsible of kind of entertaining, of being kind of like a ringmaster, that I have to pull up a magnificent show to catch their attention. And I realized that that's not sustainable. That's not really what learning is, because as you guys pointed out, I believe that learning is an innate ability and an innate function of humans. And so we are driven to do that. And we can see that as little children are growing, that nobody is actually teaching them how to do any other things that they have to do to thrive. And they're just like programmed to do it, right? And so in Semillero, we're looking to break away from that model of having a focus on what we expect the learners to be doing, or the learners to be fulfilling at certain age levels or maturity levels, because then you're really ignoring what that person is actually going through and where that person can actually learn and grow from. And so you guys pointed out very clearly too about how it's about learning through living. So that was one of our first guiding principles, is breaking away from the classroom and understanding that we can learn so much more out there where life is going on. And as much as we need to control and synthesize the environment to create a learning experience, then we are being kind of artificial. And so we're depriving ourselves from a lot of other information and opportunities to actually grow from. Instead, let's go out and find them, and let's just submerge ourselves in the uncertainty of life happening, and then grow from it. So I was one of the things that started to show is that we really have to break this paradigm, right? And back to that goes to the principle of the beginner's mind. And we were reflecting upon and maybe just romanticizing the idea of the nomad experience, but we named it as the nomad intelligence, in which like you are roaming around and have to be present, absolutely present in the moment to integrate everything that's going on, because your life depends on it, right? And then the paradox of becoming civilized is, well, thanks to all those observations and everything that you were able to integrate, you were able to start to quote unquote control your environment more, and that gave you safety, quote unquote. But then you're also then starting to ossify your possibilities to expand, and you have to be careful with that, right? And so we're trying to go back into those principles, go out to the world and humble your perception to receive and to be present, so that you can keep just adapting and moving through. And that came to us especially looking forwards to understanding, like, wow, there's so much uncertainty in this crucial point in history in which we are, where things are changing so fast and so profoundly. And this was way pre-COVID, So now that COVID happened, it's even more confirmed. Like holy smokes! Like this can, like this in Spanish we say voltear la tortilla, which is like when they're making tortillas. There's a very specific point where the cook knows when to turn the tortilla, flip it over so that it cooks on the other side, so that it doesn't break, or it doesn't get burned. So it's very delicate. But when the tortilla flips, oh boy, it's a totally different world, right? And we were thinking, well, that's what happened to human beings for millennia, and we've kind of like had the opportunity to sit on this comfort of civilization, but I think things are rattling up. That's what we were seeing. And we said, like, so what can we pass on to the folks coming in, to these youngers, that will actually give them the right tools? Because if I teach them how to use a computer, who knows if they're going to be using computers in next decade, or if it's all going to be connected through a neural interface where you don't have to key in anything. So then why am I learning how to use a keyboard? Or, just to put a very rough example. And so we focused on what kind of experiences can we create that will take us to a more transcendental type of learning. And that's where we came up with, well, the most important thing you got to know is know yourself. And then, well, the second thing you'll need with that is how to relate to others and relate to the world. And then take on your capacity to participate and put yourself in action and change your paradigms and change your reality or participate in it.
Artur, I want to certainly go into those principles more deeply, but I'm very glad you mentioned that piece around security, because as you were talking, observing what I was feeling internally, and I was feeling a little bit of a tension around this notion of, hey, we learn through experience, right? We move through life, and the more we can be tuned in and aware to what's happening and learning through that process, part of me looks at that, I'm like, that's amazing. That sounds great. Like, tell me more. And then the tension though comes in the other place, which is this desire to have the learning experience crafted for me, and I noticed that, not even necessarily like a classroom, but even now I notice as I've moved into new spaces, whether it's creating this podcast, whether it's operating as a leadership trainer or a coach or whatever, that for me, there's been this draw to, where can I go find somebody to teach me more? And how can I use established learning to guide my own process? Or, what is the environment where I can feel secure to go learn? And I see nestled within that a fear of being out in the unknown and a fear of being in the uncertainty. And certainly a lot of that is present. But also, there's a part of me that does believe that environment, learning in a context where you feel secure, learning from somebody or from an institution that has done the learning already, or a form of the learning in the direction that you want to go and can help impart that and create that for you. That's appealing. That's appealing in a way as well. I'd love for you to just comment on this tension, this desire to craft the learning experience and to learn through a crafted learning experience versus the draw to learn through just the kind of unconstrained experience of life itself.
Great, Rahul. Yeah, thank you for bringing that tension. It's so clear. And let me clarify a little bit, because I totally agree that there is no better way of learning than approaching a master or someone that has more experience, right? That's fundamental. And so when you mention a crafted learning experience, that's what I totally relate to, approaching someone that is going to share with me their baggage of experience and connect. But this is where it becomes a little different, and where I mean about the security paradigm. Well, first is that what we're trying to work with at a social learning organism, so coming back to understanding what that means for us, is first understanding that there's a radial dimension to learning, and not necessarily a hierarchical one, in which the teacher is not only teaching, the teacher is open to learning from that exchange of transferring that craft or that knowledge. And that's, we're open to redefine that relationship in which, okay, I can craft certain experiences, but I expect you to bring in your part of the experience too, so that I can learn about this exchange with you and we can learn together. I have to learn a lot about myself. I have to learn about and your relationship to whatever knowledge I have or whatever knowledge I'm trying to share with you. When the other person can connect to that, they're going to shed some light on it that I had been able to see, because that's the virtue of the other. It has a different perspective. They have a different take on it. So that's one of the aspects why we believe learning is more expansive when it's done out of social aspect. And then On the aspect of security, what I meant more is this sort of balance dynamic of going in and out. And it's being able to acquire this knowledge that in a safe environment is absolutely essential. And that's where the concept of scaffolding comes from, right? We're going to be creating different levels of experience. So I'm not just going to throw you out onto like the biggest waves when you haven't even began swimming, right? You're going to start like with smaller environments. When you believe you are now practiced and when you are now possessor of a certain craft or knowledge, then that's the first sign or opportunity that now you need to look for a way to break out of it, to now use it to take you to a new level of uncertainty, to a new level of a new dimension of unexplored territory so that you can keep learning. Otherwise, then you're just going to stop there and you're going to stay there. That's what we mean more from that, no? I hope that clarifies a little bit that dilemma. But because I think it is kind of a paradox. But then again, that's what life is all about, right? Paradoxes.
As we have explored multiple times on this show, and especially in our episode with Brian Wheeler, but I did hear you expressing some of those paradoxical elements there, Arturo, right? Of like, there's this balance. It's almost like I heard you describing an art and science of learning. You have to go to the master, but you also have to go inside to yourself. And then there's this radial component of who else you're there learning with and learning from them. And then I also heard you express, which seems really, really important, is that the master is only a master insofar as they are also knowing their own learning process. Because I think that, am I following you right? Because that ossification that we've been describing, that happens so much amongst teachers. The teacher gets tired of going through this rote process of giving over this information if they feel that their learning has stopped. That inevitably makes them appear less attractive or less of an authority to the student they are trying to impart the knowledge to. So it is, but it's paradoxical because they're still the ones that have the information. All of that seems like you talk about this idea of the organism, the social learning organism, and all of those different dynamics I just described could be seen as interactions between different individuals. And especially when you start thinking about, I'm imagining a classroom full of students. We've come to sit around the master carpenter, so to speak, or whatever it is to learn carpentry. But there's like all these different things that are going on in that room, and that the learning, the growth that's happening through the room is not just about carpentry. It's about something that is organic and bigger than the skill or any one individual. But I'm curious if you could speak to that. What is a social learning organism? Why have you guys thought of it that way? And how does that maybe impact the conversation that you and Rahul are building here around approaches to learning and genuinely getting something from our experiences?
It's huge. This learning cornerstone in life and how we approach it is so indicative of our paradigms as cultures, as societies. And I think you can see so much into a people's culture and way of seeing life if you just get around to see how they're educating, quote unquote, their children. The social learning organism is this concept that came out to us when trying to envision, kind of like Rahul was mentioning, what is the type of environment that can help us stay in that dynamic state, in that dynamic sense. When we came up with that question first, like what is that environment? What is that place? The first thing we realized is summer camps are the place where we've seen children grow. So we started analyzing what's going on there. Well, you're breaking them out of their comfort zone. You're taking them out of their common context. You're giving them space to play. You're involving them with nature. And so we said, okay, yeah, there's a lot there if we start seeing about adaptability and about opening up to the present. From there, we designed, this is kind of like the genesis. This is how the social learning organism started. We designed a camp experience for teenagers at the beginning of their teenage period for 12, 13 years old, which is an immersive theater camp that the group comes into, dives into a story that we're acting out as the day goes through. So we're all playing characters. They're not speaking to me, they're speaking to Tiasi, which is the character in that story, and recreating that reality. They're constructing the story as it goes, and slowly building their own characters in the story. and you're providing them activities that contextualize the story, contextualize the characters, and then giving them opportunities of creativity. So for instance, throwing them heaps of secondhand clothes that and scissors and yarn and string and all these tools to build their own clothes. And then you're making them participate in cooking and making the meal. So you make groups, and each group has to rotate through breakfast, lunch, and dinner, take turns to cook for everyone else. Then you're teaching them about inviting them to participate in building dug earth oven to cook and stuff like that. And by the end of this camp, these kids created a song, a theme song for the camp. They had their clothes, their characters, and it was just so clear how vibrant living just exploded in a 5-day experience. So we said, okay, we really tapped into something substantial here. What is it that happened here, right? And that's when we realized, well, created something live where everyone was aware of its needs, its need to be fed, its need to sit around the fire, and where every person was participating. And one of the things that took a lot of power was when at the end of the day, we would gather around the fire and make a circle of acknowledgement and acknowledge and give acknowledgement tokens to people in the circle about qualities that we saw that came out during the day. So thank you for helping me, cheer me up when I was having a hard time going over those rocks. That was really empathic, and we gave them language to help them that. So that's where you see, Rahul, what he means, like a crafted learning environment. We chose a language, we chose the frameworks that they could use, and we set up that circle, right? But then we just let it go. And when one of the kids turned around and said, "Can I give an acknowledgement to an adult?" And we said, "Well, yeah, of course. Like we're people, right?" They just totally we could see just how their awareness shifted, and they just became like they had like an aha moment. And after that, it was just beautiful how everyone was just so involved. And it's that, breaking away that hierarchy of you're the adult, you know what you're doing, and you know who you are, so I don't even need to acknowledge you. Where, no, wait a minute, let me humble down. I also appreciate your acknowledgement. It's just as important as if I'm getting a certificate from super important school, getting a recognition from you, because I'm a human being, and here we're being together, so thank you. And that really just, boom, opens a channel of real trust. And that's the aspect where we said, okay, so then this environment is something that's alive. It's not an organization. It's not an institution. No, it's an organism. It's alive. Every living organism, you can kind of interpret that they have a purpose. They have a kind of and that goes way back to Aristotle. That's the way he thought. But so many philosophers have dwelled around this purpose. And we said, let's kind of just think about what this organism's purpose is. The tree, its purpose is to rise up to the sun and capture as much of the light that it can, right? All right, that's its strive. What is this organism striving for? It's striving to learn. It's a learning organism. It's an organism that strives for learning, however it possibly can. And then the last part was, well, this wouldn't have happened if it was just me in the woods. It would have been totally different. Clearly, this magic just bursts out, just kind of like when you put wood, oxygen, and a little spark, and boom, you got fire, right? It's just gonna happen. That's the way it is. And that's kind of like the way this is, right? If you put the people together and the people are open to this purpose of learning and acknowledging that this relationship that we have together is a living relationship that needs to be cultivated, that needs to be taken care of, well, that's where it happens. And so that's where it came, So we said, yeah, so that sounds way much more descriptive. And we're really, really, really keen on language. We can never forget. And like in many of your other podcasts, I've heard you guys acknowledging this, the power of be careful what you think, because what you think is what you're going to say, and what you say is what you're going to do, and et cetera, right? So how are we going to name this? Because that's going to create a vessel. And so that's why we really resonated with this. Okay, this is the type of vessel that I resonate with. Yeah, how about you? Yeah, me too. This really seems, I don't know, I just get a feeling, and it was very intuitive kind of, but it was very clear. This is where we got to go around.
I love that you started with this idea of a camp. I think that image is something that many people can relate to and immediately evokes a certain feeling of participation, of creativity, of this balance between structure and creativity where there's just enough structure that you feel safe and you kind of feel protected and you know what's happening, but just enough lack of structure, is what I felt, where people can be themselves. Everyone wants to contribute. Everyone's in it together. And just as you were talking about it, I felt a lot of that electricity and just in just my imagination, as I was picturing everything that you were describing. And I'd love to at this point continue to explore that vessel, right? And understand how that vessel delivers towards those three pillars that you were talking about: the self-knowledge, the relationships, and the co-crianza, the kind of the participation and co-parenting idea. And so starting with self-knowledge, well, what exactly do you mean when you refer to self-knowledge, and how does this particular vessel encourage a development of that self-knowledge, or how does it encourage people to cultivate self-knowledge for themselves?
Thanks, Rahul, for sharing that excitement. I'm so glad to hear it. And so going to self knowledge, well, I could like put a bunch of examples, and I'll put two just to kind of bring out a more concrete imagery. One of them was when early in the process of starting this exploration of the social learning organism. My co-founder and teacher in there, Jan, he is a theatrical arts major and master degree. He's like a super well prepared theater arts teacher, and he's faced with this group of teenagers, like 12 teenagers, that are extremely unmotivated and totally disconnected from their willingness to use their bodies to express, because they were coming from very hard stories of relationships to education. So he's in there trying to move them, and he's going on it for a few weeks, and then suddenly he gets to this point where he acknowledges, he's like, guys, I'm totally broken down. Like my self confidence is totally questioned here. I'm feeling super vulnerable. I'm not feeling capable, and he exposes himself like that. Instead of trying to exercise some sort of authority and looking for us to say like, hey, kids, like if you don't behave this way or that way, or if you don't participate in this way or that way, then you guys are fired. To say, and it's sort of an example, kind of like what I'm used to was my upbringing in school. It's like, well, these are the rules, and you don't follow them, you're out. And so you kind of just participate out of like compliance. Which has a value in itself. And we could go into a deep conversation about that, right? Obedience, like what does it mean to obey and who do you obey? That's a huge topic too, beautiful. But so then what I mean there is this person, John, is acknowledging his threshold and he's sharing it. And so how we respond then is, okay, let's open this assembly with the learners and share with them like what's going on. Like what is it about this process that you guys are not open to? And we start listening to each other, opening that space to understand this is the learning opportunity, finding ourselves at that threshold. So John learned a lot about his relationship to why he's teaching, and it had to make him kind of like look into himself and see, okay, why am I looking for validation from these kids? Why is their validation important to me? And what does that touch in my personal story? So he went way into that rabbit hole, discovered a bunch of stuff. But then we opened the table up in a controlled way too, with the learners and see, let's listen to you guys. And just in the way that you open that floor to their voices and the way they start speaking out just gives them the opportunity to start listening to their stories, which is a very important process. It's very different, the stories that you're telling yourself inside. And when you start putting them out, you start seeing things so differently and you start understanding many different dimensions of what you thought was your story. I'm sure that you guys can connect to that in many ways. And so that's one aspect of self-knowledge, And then there's this part about also understanding and giving opportunity to say, look, we value all these potential capabilities that we have around communication, around self-discipline, around your thought structures. We create this framework about seeing all our different capacities available to us, and become the personal potentials, like all the possibilities you have to develop. And we open them to start observing, like, where are you working on these, and where are you feeling challenged? When you're feeling challenged in this theater class, what part of it is it that you're feeling challenged? Do you feel you don't connecting because you don't like John, or because you don't feel safe about using these capacities, or that the other person is going to make fun of you? And so you start giving them space and tools to also learn how to experience that discomfort, not run away from it, not turn away from it, or just lock into, as we were saying, and ossify this character that you build about yourself, that I am the one that doesn't move, I am the one that doesn't dance, I have no rhythm, or I don't do arts, I don't do math, said one of the kids, and now this kid self-taught himself calculus and programming, but he started off 3 years ago telling me, no, I don't do math, I don't like math, no, math is not. That is the self-knowledge part. And so the point of the social learning organism is open ourselves to a commitment that we will all be willing to look into ourselves that way. And we create scaffolds, structures that will give us tools. And by the end of by the later stages of the program, as the teenagers are growing, we start going also into different paradigms of self-knowledge. So I'm not just going to talk to you about psychology. Let's talk about astrology. Let's talk about the different personality types, and giving them different tools and explore them, see which one resonates for you.
I love the example you shared, because as I think Rahul, you expressed this earlier, I've been feeling this throughout, this tension of, it sounds so nice as you're sharing this camp thing. It touches something very familiar and important to me that reminds me of something that I care a lot about and I want that. And then there's this other voice that's like, yeah, but how is it going to train me to technically succeed and know how to do X, Y, and Z task, whether it's a technical task or, a task to make a bunch of money? And it's this other voice that kind of reverts back into conventional structures of power, and knowledge. And like, if I climb those things, then I will get rewarded, right? And that's my way to create security. Inside, you've emphasized these pillars: self-knowledge, relationships, co-creation, co-crianza, co-parenting. And yet within all of those, there is this, what I hear in that story is this idea of transparency and vulnerability and being willing to be honest, to be yourself. What that models and how that promotes this flow of exchange and information and vulnerable experiences that creates more safety and creates an environment where people can learn and are also learning through that expression of vulnerability, rather than shutting it down, close the book, put on my suit, go to school, get a degree, make a bunch of money, and be safe. That's what I find radically challenging about your project, Arturo, and also inspiring and also a little scary, because it's a challenge, right? It's like, oh, wow, okay, that's something different than the pattern that most of us are probably running when it comes to education. So on that note, I do want to connect this back to our everyday lives. It sounds like the students that are getting to learn with you are lucky. There's a particular project, and I know there's lots of projects of this and similar things going on all over the world, which is amazing. But for the average listener who's maybe similar to Rahul and I, who is being drawn to what you're saying, but also has this very, very strong other narrative, I'm curious if you can help us make some connections. How do these concepts matter to us? And I'll just say generally, I mean, if you're a child or underage, you're listening to this, awesome. This is a all ages podcast. But, really thinking about, for adults listening to the show, what are the concepts we're talking about that matter in their life, in our lives, that we need to apply to actually change what we're experiencing as life? I just want to come back to that, because I feel like one of the big losses, another easy out for people listening to this, is to be like, oh, well, it was kind of an interesting episode, and they talked about this school that was in Mexico and was kind of abstract. And it's like, it's an event happening at this school in Mexico. And that's not the point of this episode, right? That the point is that actually this is a paradigm shift, if we're not there, that we actually need in our own lives for our own spiritual and personal growth. And so I'm curious if you can kind of make some connections for us. What are the takeaways that people listening can integrate into their life that matter to them and that are maybe can shine a light on maybe some blind spots that we're all carrying around?
Yeah, sure. That's a really, really valuable intention, transferring this to our day-to-day life. And well, in the first place, that has been the sort of like what we're striving for, is how to make Semillero, how to make a social learning organism be as close to day-to-day life as we can, so that there's not this also disconnect, this separation of environments. And so I'll tell you about my personal story, like what has this project taken me into, and maybe that way that can relate, right? So what does this philosophy of the social learning organism taken me to? Well, number one, it's taken me to realize that the actual bringing about of a community is the hardest thing, but also the most valuable asset that we have as human beings. And that's happened especially in the later stage of our project right now, as it expanded from working exclusively with teenagers to now working with families with children of all ages. And so now we've been able to see the real potential in the intergenerational exchange. And that started to happen last year when we created this little capsule of collaboration where once a week, a group of homeschooling little kids, 4-year-olds, would come into our space and our teenagers would host them for a day of activities. And so they would plan them and then they would host them. And just seeing how precisely that exchange of or that learning was transferred between all generations was magnificent. And I think we all have that experience very accessible to us in families, especially people that have been able to live through larger families where you were mixed with people of all ages. That for me has been very valuable into acknowledging like what a social learning organism really needs is this network of diversity, of diverse knowledge, diverse experiences. That's been also an opportunity I've had to expand my paradigm about the relationships I hold with my larger community. So now when I go around and go into a social gathering, for instance, I don't see the kids play as just kids play. I see it as a rich opportunity to connect to these beings that are seeing the world in a totally different way that could give me a little insight into something that I haven't experienced. So I'll approach them and play with them if I can, or observe their play from a place of humbleness and learning. I want to see what they are. I want to see what these people are. And as well as when I sit down and have a conversation with my parents, which have these ossified ideas that I sometimes have such a big challenge in not reacting towards them, but then pausing and realizing they're just as valid. They have their stories, so let me connect to them. They're my parents, but they have their stories, and understand that they have a lot to still share with me. They're part of my organism, of my learning organism. They're part of my social. So that's been a very valuable asset for me to be aware of that. My social learning organism is not just Semillero, really. It's about all around me, and that's what we're trying to also use Semillero as, just like this little controlled setting. The participant can then experience a controlled, safe environment to practice that, so that then they can go out and expand it and use it to connect with their larger. That's the part of the social living part of it that is beautiful, because at the end of the day, that's what civilization is. We're just like all these bunch of little social learning organism nodes all around. So if you can do it whenever, you can do it whenever and wherever you are. Just it requires that change in paradigm. So that's been one of the parts for me. And the other is to understand and put in practice also the aspect that at the end of the day, the most rich learning is going to happen at the relational level. Whether I need to make money or I need to pass that exam or get that skill done, the most valuable learning for me has come from what I do with that, who I do it with. and how that connects me to interact and exchange knowledge and experiences with other people. So I think that's what the social learning organism of Semillero is helpful for. It's just a metaphor, right? To be able to take this template and translate it into your context and look around. What is your learning organism? Where is it? How are you relating to it? And how are you in all those degrees, right? And how are you relating, first of all, to yourself? And then how are you relating to the others in your learning organism? And how are you guys, your learning organism, relating to to your surrounding? And what story is that telling? What kind of camp is that? Is that the kind of camp you're excited to be in? Are you happy to be in the camp? Are you stoked? Because if not, it's like, well, like, you only have to start like, well, you have to, it's a huge playground, so just like propose them, like, what do you want to happen on this camp, who's telling you it's not possible? um and that's what this new version of the organism has been, like a bunch of families getting together and saying, like, let's build this camp. But I'll tell you one thing, what we've realized too is that it's super challenging, that it's obviously not as easy as said, right, to be doing it, but it's as worth of it. It's worth every hour of it. And it requires also just to put like put down your expectations and look at where you actually are. What is your organism? How is it? Check it. Do a little checkup. As adults, that starts to ring a lot for us as we grow older, because it's like, you're always aware that well, you might be starting a process of decadence and decay, and so you're gonna have to be checking which part of your systems and how they are. And when you have little kids, you're also very aware of that, because you're very concerned about how they're growing, and so you're always checking up. But we lose sight of our social organism. How is it? And we should be checking the state of that constantly.
Arturo, I really appreciate your grounding it in your experience. One of the things I know Gabe and I were talking about before was wanting to understand how the experience of going into this space and Semiero, as well as just your general curiosity and commitment to education, how it changed you. What I took away from what you just said was a few different things. One is this idea, first starting with this idea that all of us are part of a social learning organism, and that everything around us contributes to that learning organism. And part of me is even inclined to maybe even drop the social aspect, because it's not even just people, right? You can learn from nature, from inanimate objects, from just the way that the world operates. And for me, takeaway number one is shifting our mindset or our perspective to see the world and to see our worlds, each of our individual worlds and collective worlds, as part of our own learning organisms. The second thing that I heard in the way that you were talking about how you would approach kids or how you'd approach parents was what was more like an orientation, an inner orientation around how to approach any situation. And I saw that you were discarding judgment, you were discarding an attitude of like, I know what's right, arrogance, and instead really orienting around curiosity, regardless of what's in front of you, openness, what you're taking in from what's in front of you, humility, and then also this sense of contribution, right? Or participation, that, hey, I am also a contributor to the system and to the organism. And so pairing those two things, right? So first, this belief that, hey, we're all connected in this learning organism, and then coming to the learning organism with curiosity and openness, with humility, with a willingness to participate in contribution and contribute. I then heard the third piece where you were going is around design, right? Around creating the community that brings with it diversity of knowledge and experience, and that brings with it a sense of belonging, right? Or a sense of activation, like, hey, I'm in the right place. My environment is actually bringing out my best, or my curiosity, or my learner mindset, or my beginner mindset. So just wanted to pose all of that to you, right? This idea of like start with the belief that, hey, we're all part of a learning organism. Come to it with curiosity, openness, humility, and a desire to contribute. And then keep playing around with the design of that organism so that it's serving you and bringing you diversity of experience and bringing out the best in you. I just wanted to pose all that to you and see if I'm tracking it correctly, if that seems right, and also just what that prompts for you, if there's anything you would add to fill out that picture.
Great, Rahul. Yeah, I totally resonate with all this nice roundup that you did of all those points. And the one thing that comes up to me as I heard you doing this summary is that around all that, I think the key part we touched upon is also the courage for vulnerability. And that's what's been really valuable to me in this social learning organism. That for it to really connect, we need to make a big effort to create a safe environment for vulnerability. So I can start with putting forward, like, what am I experiencing right now? And that happened to me. I've taken some of these practices and put them in another context, transfer them into another context, because as a learner, for me, that's a clear indicator of practice, of mastery. That you can take a knowledge and transfer it to a different context. It happened to me like in a family vacation where we had just gone into this family trip, and we ended up in a kind of like a very haphazardly experience of kind of getting jibbed with some massages and stuff like that on a beach that we didn't want. And the massagers just came up to us and started like touching our bodies, and so it was a very intense experience. And at night at dinner, I brought it up. I said, like, guys, like, I really want to talk about what happened today. Like, I feel this. This is what I felt. How do you guys feel about it? Like, what did you feel? And just sharing our feelings about it. And instead of just like going around our usual format of dinners, of just starting to talk about like this or that other thing or other person, or just like our small talk, just actually going right into the beef of it. Like, I don't want to let this go. And it was really special. And I've seen that was something that I practiced with the learners at Semillero in the assembly, kind of like what happened with Jan in the theater arts class. Like, right, this is happening, and we're not just going to try to use our typical just like tool set. Let's first try to understand what's going on. Let's go into self-knowledge, like really understand and like, what is this telling us about us, about our organism, about you, about your organism, your configuration. And taking that courage is a great starting place. Always being able to put that forward, like, how does this make you feel? Like, let me tell you how this makes me feel, and how does this make you feel? And then we can connect. Then we can start doing all the other stuff.
That's so powerful, and is something that, again, stands in really stark contrast to a lot of the dynamics and that exist within our institution. Thinking again about, I've got this figure in my head through our conversation who's, I think I described them a little earlier. They're in a business suit. They've got a briefcase. They are powerful. They've got degrees, and they're laughing at the whole conversation. They're not interested in it. They don't see the value. And then I keep imagining that character, and your call for the courage for vulnerability, Arturo, really stands out to me in that context, because I think when you start to think about this, and I hope listeners who have followed us this far on this episode can sort of see that when you really start to look out, you see how silly and widespread this expert syndrome is in our culture, and it's propped up by all these. It's not safe to be vulnerable in all sorts of environments, in lots of different school environments or work environments or family environments. We actually have this widespread need for, we call it different things, keeping up with the Joneses, being in developing your expertise, your niche, fighting for that, working at that. And it's this, and there are hard-earned victories that happen there, but it's just such also a sad process when you think about it from the lens we're looking at it today. The shutting down and the absence of that more honest humanity, that I think creates, as your stories emphasize, and it certainly relates with my personal experience, that vulnerability creates the avenue through which to be transformed into like an actual experience of wholeness or love or or connection with someone else. Like you feel like you're really getting your money's worth, so to speak, out of life, not to invoke capitalism too much, but that is all there within that as an opportunity. And yet so many of us, I think, struggle to get there. And so, as we're kind of coming up on the close of our episode today, I'm wondering if you have any words of advice for us, for those of us grappling with that briefcased, suited up warrior that's going to, know their facts and win in society. How can we take a first step towards practicing vulnerability or approaching learning in this way? And how can we do it in a way that's safe for us? Because there are a lot of unsafe environments to do that out in the world.
Wow, yeah, that's a monumental question, Gabe. But I totally relate with that character, and part of our build paradigms, because what I've seen too is that there's space for both of these characters to be within us, and that's what our camp is all about. Beleriand, it's called, inspired on Tolkien's Silmarillion. In Beleriand, you are invited to recreate a character. You're giving a kind of like a blank slate. Like, look, here's this fantasy land. Who do you want to be here? And you see that the children usually try to step out of their usual characters. They're looking for opportunities like that. They take that courageous step. We don't, because we feel we have so much more at stake, right? So much more security at stake to do that out in the world. But my final remark on that would be like, I can't give any advice. I think that's a very personal path for everyone. And I would just encourage everyone that the sooner you start exploring your way through that path, the sooner you will access also monumental capacities of growth. But what I've seen with the learners at the social learning organism is that although seemingly you are quote unquote wasting time on the emotional stuff, which is what the guy in the suit would laugh about, like, why are you guys wasting time on that? Like, what that question, answering that question is just costing me like $3,000, like, or something like that. You realize that it's an investment. You're investing those time, because at the end, the potential that you can tap into as your social learning organism is more vibrant and healthier. Your market cap, it just like blows like exponentially. You just enter like a whole new dimension of market, and it's actually very limited to see it in it has to be one or the other, because I totally value that we want to get things done. We get, it's a very important part of our beings also to feel that the rewards of success, but it's where you put those goals at, and what are you looking for those goals. When you just give yourself the time to re-explore that, like, how are you going to set up those goals, and you do it as a group, you share it. That's just, I think, the key takeaway with the social learning organism is just the importance of just share it. Co-create is a keyword, and to co-create really at its maximum capacity, you're going to have to do it through getting through a lot of relational obstacles and a lot of self paradigm obstacles that are painful. And that's where the growth is, growing pains.
Well, Arturo, I just want to thank you for being a part of this dialogue and for bringing your story and your experience into our conversation with us. And certainly, I was taking some notes as we were talking and thinking about people that I know who've really embodied this mindset, all of the different things that we've been talking about, the humility, the openness, the beginner's mind, the vulnerability, the co-creation, the willingness to engage with others, just all of these things. And it's been interesting reflecting on it, and feeling within myself a desire to reorient or kind of bring myself into deeper orientation, or closer orientation, I should say, with those ways of being. And just as even in thinking about it, I've felt a lightness, and an openness and an excitement and a curiosity, not directed at anything in particular, but just in general, kind of towards life. And I just want to thank you for kind of cultivating that and for bringing that out, and for being, for spending your time with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. I totally share that experience. This conversation has helped me see so many other aspects of what this experience has been for me so far.
So on that note, Arturo, I want to thank you again as well. And what I'd like to put out to folks listening is to orient towards your social learning organism. As you were just speaking, Rahul, and thinking about Arturo, I alluded to this earlier in the show, but I think now is a good time to name it more, which is that I've known Arturo since he was a 21-year-old chemical engineering student. And I feel like through my relationship with you, my friend, I've learned so much, and through your example, and I would guess it's the same the other way. And that's part of a social learning organism. I think this show, if you've been listening to us, and I know there's a few of you out there who really do follow our show, this is a social learning organism. We put it out there. It's not lip service, but reach out to us. We've gotten to have some interactions with folks about that, which has been really amazing. Hearing about what's happening for you as you're listening, and through that, I know that a lot of the principles we've talked about have gotten Rahul, you and I, through challenging moments and helped us to grow in our dynamic. And I think that's reflected in the kind of shows that we're able to host. And so on that note, I invite you, if you're listening, to turn your mindset towards that. Who are your people? What is the organism that you are a part of? And in the broadest sense, I think we're all part of something together. And, maybe that's a topic for another show, but really thinking about the fact that, we are all nodes in the cells. We're all cells in this greater something else that is kind of emerging. And we've got technologies that help us communicate. And we're in a kind of emergent part of history where our individual selves are also part of something bigger. And so there's that big kind of trippy philosophical thing to consider. And then there's the stuff that's close to home. And so is it your family? Is it the close friends in your life? Is it your team at work? Well, how's the organism doing? How are you contributing? How's your own learning mindset and beginner's mind? And I'm sure, I hope it's doing better after our episode today. And I wish you all the best in going deeper into your honest truth. And from that, may a lot of love and connection and learning come forward for you and for everyone in your life. So on that note, I just want to say thank you again for joining us. As a reminder, please do leave us a review. Like our show wherever you do listen to podcasts. You can also join our newsletter to follow along for any updates at wovenwings.net. Thank you so much again for joining us today. We're wishing you a bright and vibrant time engaging with the true depths of your being in an ongoing learning process. May your life be blessed with growth. Thank you so much for being part of our journey, and we will see you next time. Take care.